Welcome to Trust Talk. Our guest today is Erik Schoppen, author of the upcoming book Trust Reset, a radical new vision on trust. He challenges traditional trust theories, arguing that our rapidly changing world demands fresh perspectives. He explains the evolution of trust from ancient neural networks to today's complex digital systems and introduces what he calls an integrated multi-level trust framework. We explore how trust functions on both personal and societal levels, the impact of AI on trust, and why understanding the core of trust is more crucial than ever. Tune in for a conversation that will make you rethink the very foundations of trust. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Erik, welcome to Trust Talk. The reason why we're having this interview is because you are about to publish a book called Trust Reset, a radical new vision on trust. And I was intrigued by especially the radical new vision. And then we had an early discussion before this interview about what we could expect from the subject. From that, I understand that it is not an easy subject, a subject that actually was covered earlier in my interview with Paul Zak. But let's give it a try and see where it brings us. Given the extensive existing theories on trust, is there really room for a radical new vision, as you call it in your title of your book? Why do we need a new perspective? Aren't the current theories sufficient to understand and navigate trust?
Hi, Severin. Thank you for your question. And thank you so much for having me in your Trust Talk podcast. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be one of the recognized trust experts you interview. Regarding your question, do we need a new perspective on trust? Well, I believe so. I think so. Times are changing, and most of the trust theory is researched and developed when the world was, in my view, another place. We have drastic innovations. We are entering a new realm where new trust rules and constructs are developing as we speak. In technology, in AI, in the climate crisis. So there's a lot of new research going on. So the way we trust our world is changing. We are now living in a VUCA world. I hope to share these views, or at least a few of these insights in this podcast. And first of all, it's not that the current theory goes overboard in my upcoming book. It's rather the contrary. My book offers an overall insight on the existing trust theory, because that's where you start with. But the science-based theory I provide in my book is also based on the latest insights on biological and artificial research, and that makes it, in my view, different. And for the reader, it will be a journey into the development of trust, starting from its molecular origins, which I think is an underexposed topic in trust research, to complex social and digital systems, to its implications on a planetary scale. So we go from micro to macro.
You begin your book by discussing the hypothesis that trust has always been part of evolution, from neural networks in our ancestors to modern social networks. We like to hear from you how this approach is different from all the views on trust we have discussed in the previous interviews I had in this podcast.
So in the first place, this should tell you how hard it is to bring new concepts into trust science, as you mentioned before. So let me clarify the difference in my approach. And this will take a little time because I have to explain it in a broader sense. Not this distance, my readers, I combine already published work with new insights, which I just previously mentioned. But it's also building the scientific fundament that reaches also trust on. So I added new science-based theory as I tried to create a holistic vision on trust. And in the book, we walk you through several trust levels that increase in complexity and where we use different networks for different survival strategies. So, for example, one of the differences is that what we call trust developed in organisms out of self-protection, which were survival mechanisms dating back around 300 million years ago, in the first neural networks. This shaped the wiring for our later developed three biological forms of trust. This is the behavioral, this is the affective, and the cognitive trust attitudes. We also know this as the CAP model, so the CEB. And I explain this in my book as well. These trust attitudes play a role in self-trust, that's the first level of the framework, but also in other levels. And in this way, you can measure them in all the levels. So, for example, the second level is that we interact socially with each other in dyads and in groups. And this is just another survival strategy to cope with the changes in our environment. And therefore, you need to trust each other on a social level. Well, this is already known. But you also need to trust each other in social networks, where you had long-lasting relationships based on kinship, reciprocity, and the willingness to share risks. So we could hunt together, barter goods, share knowledge and resources. And this all happened in what we call the cognitive revolution. And I want to walk you through this build-up so that makes more sense also for the listener. So the next big thing in human evolution was the development of larger networks as we traded stuff far beyond our own territory. We also developed our trust in time, which was a real new concept. That is the trust based on your knowledge to predict cyclic events in the future, which I also mention later on in the book. And this has not only accelerated the agricultural revolution, but it also started the development of more complex systems, which require different forms of trust based on deferred trust, for example, and that you get something delivered on a later moment. This is important for trading. And we ordered ourselves in an organizational level. And this is the third level of the framework. We settled in larger cities. We developed abstract thinking, writing, math to administrate our resources as we needed a huge population concentrated in one location. And this changed the way we trusted each other on a larger organizational scale and later on a system level beyond our personal scope. And we did this for a simple reason, to ensure safety, stability, facilitating ways to produce and cooperate on a larger scale. And this eventually led to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. And we developed trust in technology, which was also a new concept, and became dependent on machines and complex production processes in factories. And this was the start of our trust in systems, and that's the fourth level. Now, what's the case? As technology and processes become more complex, you need to analyze and structure all this data, because this is the source you trust upon. And this was new. And you have to translate this data into trustworthy information that you can use to predict economic outcomes. So you have to trust on data. And this led to the information revolution in the mid-20s.
Can you elaborate on when survival mechanisms we associate with trust first appeared, and how these ancient structures still influence our lives today?
Most of our primordial brain, the early developed brain, is an accumulation of early developed neural substrates. These are the parts of the central nervous system, including your brain and your spinal cord. And that led to specific sensory information processes and behaviors. So, for example, as we detect the scent of food before we put it in our mouth, we are using a 500 million years old olfactory system. And this is a system that we still use in the modern world. So in essence, your brain is a wired organ that uses sensory information to find material, food, and security. And even more important, to get out of the way for possible dangers and pain. And these are the elementary aspects of trust still relevant today.
So you suggest that trust is a multi-dimensional construct that has evolved from early neural networks to complex global systems, advocating what you earlier mentioned, a holistic view that differs from traditional definitions of trust. You still need to convince me why it is important to understand trust from such a different perspective.
Well, many publications agree that trust is omnipresent. So this is also a perspective. And definitions about this vary from making decisions, experiencing and acting based on past events, but also looking for stability and also to predict future circumstances. Now, some definitions apply for specific situations, and I think this is important. Think of trusting your door lock or a car. Some are more social in nature, for example, trusting your neighbors that may water the plants when you're on holiday or vacation. But these are more generic concepts. For example, accepting the risk of being vulnerable. That's a common definition of trust, which is applicable in many situations. So trust definitions are okay because they help us in defining existing and new aspects of trust. But in my book, I provide an overview of definitions also, so that's not the point. But if you take a close look in the essence of what is trust, then you see that a lot of definitions describe the functions of trust and not trust itself. So what I did, I took a close look, but I also took a distance. In my view, we can think of trust as a multidimensional construct consisting of expanding networks that go through the levels, which I just explained, and they increase in complexity. And actually, you can make it even more abstract, is that trust is information that can flow back and forth through these levels and also in dimensions in time and space. I hope this is not too abstract, but you can measure actually this information based on the trust attitudes. So I hope this helps.
You talk about trust being a circular loop. Can you break down what you mean by this? How does this cyclical process of regain, rebuild, and renew show up in everyday lives and in society as a whole? And how do these changes in trust affect us mentally, physically, and even in the digital world?
Good question, good question. Changes in trust have always existed on a personal level, social level, or on a systemic level, and even on a societal scale. But what these changes have in common is that they all share the same circular trust process. This is a cyclical process, which I call the circular trust loop in my book. And it has three transformational processes. It's the regain process, how to get trust back when it's lost. The rebuilding process, well, what kind of tools are you going to use to rebuild the trust for the population? And then you have the renew process. This is when you predict the future based on these trust processes. It helps to regain trust, for example, if you start with already worked in the past. These are the best practices and what people are familiar with. And this is the initial step that can happen fast, depending on the severity of the damage that was done. For example, in society, at the moment, there is a lot of conflicts going on in the world. And what you can see is that people are looking for new ways to restore trust in our societies. So this whole process of regaining trust is actually building a foundation to rebuild trust for the population. And therefore, you have to convince people that the predictions that you make in these processes, they are safe for the future. That means that they have to trust on creating something that is new and potentially better for the future.
As you know, Erik, I interviewed Paul Zak for this podcast earlier. His research suggests that trust is deeply rooted in our biology, particularly through the neurochemical oxytocin, which signals trustworthiness and fosters cooperation. Given your focus on the evolutionary and neurological aspects of trust, how do you reconcile Zak's findings with your own theories? Do you believe that understanding the biological basis of trust like Zak proposes is sufficient? Or do we need to incorporate more multidimensional approaches as you suggest in your trust reset?
Now, first of all, I highly respect Paul Zak and his work in the field of trust. And I agree with him that trust is rooted in biology. That's the fundament. It's not only through oxytocin, by the way, that was one of his research topics, but also other neurochemicals like hormones and even pheromones play a role in the forming and shaping of trust. For example, dopamine and serotonin, motivators, also in bonding and cooperation. But if you want to measure trust attitudes on a higher level, you need to investigate trust on the multidimensional aspects as well. And for that purpose, I developed the integrated multi-level trust framework in my book. If you look at the nature of trust, this is about how the brain and the body respond to thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in relation to the interaction with other living species and to non-living components, for example, trusting in ecosystems. This is in your environment and also the conditions in our biosphere. We have huge challenges for the climate crisis. So trust goes actually from a molecular, micro scale, which is the work of Zak, to a global macro scale, which I think is of main importance as well.
You mentioned earlier trust attitudes. And you claim that they stem from different brain functions that have evolved over time. Can you break down how these functions, like assessing risk, experiencing fear, and instinctive behavior, shape the way we trust today? How do these cognitive, emotional, and instinctive responses interact to influence our decisions and actions?
What I just mentioned before, trust attitudes are biological and mental structures that can be described as the cognitive, that's the reasonable part, the affective, that's the emotional part, and the conative, that's the behavioral part of trust. As already mentioned, these are the gap model or the gap attitudes. Now, to explain them shortly, cognitive attitudes involve explicit rational thoughts, beliefs, and attributes associated to an object or a person. But it's also our belief in someone's or something's reliability or integrity based on their past experience, on their reputation. Now, affective trust attitudes are our feelings towards a subject. That can be a thing, it can be a person. When it comes to trust, this might involve feelings of security when thinking about a particular person, or a sense of fear or unease when dealing with something we don't trust. And lastly, and this is also the oldest form of trust attitudes, those are the conative, behavioral trust attitudes. And these involve our mostly implicit actions and also our behavioral intentions towards a subject. So in a trust context, this could be our willingness to rely on something or to put ourselves in a vulnerable position because we trust them. So let me give you an example. So let's say you interview someone for a job and you start talking to this person. So what happens? Does this person represent the expectations that you have of that person? I mean, it's in the way the answers that are provided. And what you can see is that trust is often grounded in cognitive, rational assessments and beliefs about the reliability of the people that we want to trust. So this is the cognitive part. And then the next one is, do you see yourself working with that person? So this is about affective trust. This is about how warm a person is, and it's based on an emotional bond. If you work together for a longer period of time, you have to have the confidence and feelings that you can attribute to that person to work together. No one wants to work with the persons that are not friendly. And then for the behavioral part, it involves our willingness to act and engage with that person. So your brain makes an estimate of that person, it's a mental model, based on the information that you have about the applicant. So in short, you want to know how this person thinks, feels, and does to predict a shared future together based on trust.
Given the extensive research on trust conducted by behavioral scientists in the fields of sociology, economics, and psychology, do you worry that your new approach might face skepticism or even resistance from these established disciplines?
I don't know. It's not only the new approach on trust, but it's also a new perception on nature itself. That's my humble opinion, to understand the origin and essence of trust. I mean, this is why I start with the earliest beginning in evolution. If you understand these processes, then you understand the later developed concepts of trust more. So it's not that I'm totally right in my book. It's partly hypothesis, especially the parts of AI, for example. But I still think that for scientists can be interesting, for psychology, for sociology, but even for economics. And I'm attacking no one. I just want to offer a holistic approach which overlaps with so many interesting research fields, from the early start of organic life to possible futures of AI. Yeah, and I already said that we live in a very insecure VUCA world. It's vulnerable, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguous. Where we are on a brink that we are facing a situation that trust is actually almost totally lost. It's estimated within 2-3 years, almost 100% of all the available information on the internet is not trustworthy anymore because you cannot find the resources anymore to do the fact checking. So we have to overcome giant challenges. And I don't believe that you solve these problems by pinpointing on different specific areas in trust research. I mean, I have a lot of books about trust research. It's easier to write a book about one topic. So that was my challenge. So this is why I called the book Trust Reset. I mean, it's a new way of looking at all these separate silos, maybe in the academic field, to bring it back in one framework. And of course, I hope it will start a discussion.
You mentioned the future of trust and the role of AI in your book. Can you explain how AI's way of processing trust is different from humans? And looking ahead, should we be more concerned about whether AI will trust us rather than if we trust AI, given their faster and more logical processing capabilities?
Excellent question. Yes, I mentioned the hypothesis that it is not a question if we trust AI in the future, but if AI will trust us. I think that's a very challenging concept because it forces us to think, should we give AI autonomous behavior? Do we provide programming that AI can think and make decisions for itself? But you can also look at AI from an evolutionary perspective because AI processes trust differently than humans. We have a biochemical system, but we still both use neural networks. But still though, AI will have another level of abstract thinking. I don't know if we can cope with this fast thinking. We use slow communication by the use of cells and neurochemicals. We have a limited conscious calculation power. I mean, if you have to remember more than 7 chunks, it's already difficult. And AI will compute information 1 million to even 1 billion times faster. So the question is not whether we as humans will trust AI, but whether AI will trust us, because they operate in a different realm, different computer power and speed. And I think they will see in the end, they will perceive humans as untrustworthy, emotional, even irrational. So at the point that we're walking into a new era right now, I think that smart technology is becoming more and more invasive, for example, in our bodies, but also in our mental lives. We're becoming totally dependent on AI assistants, for example. But it also has an effect on how we trust each other. For example, if you are represented in the virtual world by an AI systems, and I have one, they are going to talk to each other on another level than we do. So are these AI assistants, are they going to trust each other, for example? But do we trust our AI assistant when they share information maybe that we don't want? So I think we have a lot of questions to solve. And I think this is a complete new field in the research of trust when you compare this with AI.
Well, we're going to end with this, and I hope that your book, by the way, when you expect it to be published?
Well, actually, that's hard to say. I mean, I hope in the end of this year, maybe early next year. But you can find information on the website, www.trustreset.com, where you can find updates on the release of the book.
Well, I hope the book will also give rise to debate among trust researchers, and hopefully we get insights on your views. Thank you very much for being our guest. And wish you good luck, because we all know that the final stage of a book is the most difficult one.
Yes. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.